80% of the global population will will be living in cities by 2050, which in terms of India and ASEAN alone means close to 700 million people. In the over next 2 or 3 decades, you'll see a shift from rural areas to urban areas. And of course, that's both a huge challenge, but also a great opportunity. In India, we have, of course, embarked on a very ambitious program of 100 smart cities. We have the mission director, Mr. Kunal Kumar, who will be giving the keynote address. But ASEAN too has identified 26 smart cities. They're creating a special network. Of course, ASEAN, while the average would be somewhere close to what India is in terms of urbanization, but it has a wide spectrum. Singapore, which has 100% urbanization, and we have a very able representative who has also served in Delhi as Deputy High Commissioner here, Mr. To. And reason for urbanization, a catalyst, but will also lead to that incremental growth in global GDP that we will see will be contributed by Asia. Of course, our minister has in his, one of his speeches has said that safe and smart cities are no longer a matter of choice, it's a matter of imperative. And I must tell you that while, of course, the West, you see very good smart cities and urbanization has been a long-standing trend, Asian cities would be different. Basically because our societies are organized differently, our family households are different, our expectations when we move to a city is different. Each household, you'll see, requires perhaps an army of support staff. So these cities would be very different from what you see the good and nice cities and aesthetic cities in Europe. But with these words, let me ask the experts to speak to you. I'll start with Mr. Kunal Kumar, who represents our Ministry of Urban Development and the Smart City Director for Smart Cities. Mr. Kunal, would you like to speak from here or there? Please. So each speaker has 10 minutes so that we have time for question and answer and interaction.
I'll begin. Thank you, Ambassador Amar Sinha, and esteemed guests on the dais and members of the audience. I'll be very brief, and I'll just briefly describe India's smart cities mission. Urbanization in India is not for the weak-hearted, and all of us know how dynamic the scene is when we look at the cities of the country. Urbanization, incidentally, is, I think, one of the 3 most important issues facing the world today, apart from energy and climate change. And if you see the relations between the 3, urbanization actually is the biggest factor of impact, whether we look at energy and climate change going forward too. Most of the urbanization that is happening today is happening in the countries of Africa and countries like India and South Asian countries. And therefore, what happens in urbanization and what happens in urban areas in these countries going forward is pretty much going to decide what happens in urbanization across the world, what happens to the energy and climate change scenario for the world going forward. So these are very critical issues, require a lot of complex thinking. We at the Ministry of Housing and Urban Affairs work on multiple different programs to be able to meet the challenge of urban growth and urban diversification that's happening in our country. So we have the Swachh Bharat program where we are looking and focusing on how to make our cities cleaner. We are focusing on housing for all, where we are looking at providing affordable housing to the millions of people who are looking for housing in the country, who cannot otherwise afford housing in the country. And the Smart Cities mission, where we are looking at a certain set of cities, 100 cities, where we're trying to initiate action plans and trying to see that these cities embrace the new urbanism and are able to essentially work in a way that makes ease of living happen for citizens. So with that background, I would How do we move ahead? Yeah. So this was the launch of the program on the 25th of June 2015. These were the words the Prime Minister had used then. And this is a unique program in its own way because the first time the element of competition was introduced into selection of cities. So 100 cities that have been selected today have been selected through a process of competition and through a process of extensive citizen engagement. The program as to what the cities have to do was not decided by bureaucrats or ministers. It was decided by the people and then is now being implemented by the city managers and the mission across the country. Broadly, if you look at the strategy of the mission is based on two levels of activity. One is activities which fall in the bucket of the pan-city development framework, wherein we take up certain areas, especially technology-driven, technology-oriented, solvable by technology across the city to create solutions for the myriad problems that the cities face. The second, of course, is the area-based development approach, where we look at certain areas within the city and we look at either greenfield, either retrofitting, or either redevelopment kind of initiatives, where that area is taken up holistically in a complete transformative way to create a model which is then replicated across the city. Problems in the city are very complex, multidimensional, and present themselves at multiple levels. A problem of water could also be a problem of traffic, could also be a problem of environment. And therefore, when we look at things, we have to ingrain the same level of complexity in the project formulation. And that is what is happening under the Smart Cities mission in our country. If you see just any example, for example, if you really want to solve what most people in cities today are fascinated about solving is the traffic problem. Is traffic the problem, or is it something else? Is the real problem something else? And while we go on to solve the traffic problem, we shouldn't go on exaggerating two other problems, which is the environment and the problem of maybe the safety of people on the roads, because the number of accidents increase. So these are very complex issues, and therefore through this multidimensional approach and by dividing them into various buckets, we're trying to figure out how we actually break the problem into simpler bits and solve them in an integrated manner. This is the financial landscape of the Smart Cities mission. So far, projects worth about $30 billion have been identified in about 100 cities, and they are in various phases of implementation. As you see in the slide, cities have been selected in various rounds, and therefore the fourth round, as you see, has been selected very recently in January 2018. In fact, the last city made it to the 100 list only in June this year, which is about a month and a half back. If I just talk about the financial progress of how the mission is shaped, because I'm talking of the mission. If you see the 30 billion, I'm sorry because this slide is in crores, which is 10 billion rupees. But if you see the $30 billion, about 1/6 of it has already found shape on ground, and about another 1/5 of it is under the process of implementation in various stages, and the rest of the projects are being planned. So that is the current status 3 years down the line, and cities have been selected over the past 3 years. They would be working on these projects over the next 2 to 3 years, and in some cases 5 years for cities who have been selected this year, and to be able to deliver this basket of projects. So this is just a breakup of the project status as I just mentioned. Now these are some of the projects. I just want to give you a highlight of what is happening under the mission. So what are those different big strategic areas that we are working on? And these are some of the elements which fall within the strategic areas, like command and control centers. We're talking about complete streets. We're talking of how do we use non-renewable sources of energy? How do you use sources of energy which are more sustainable? Smart water. How do we manage our water and wastewater resources, water resources and wastewater in a proper way? How do we, in fact, encourage more and more partnership-based approach to project formulation? How do we encourage public-private partnerships? Parks, waterfronts, heritage, urban spaces, placemaking, and things like that. The 4 big buckets on which I can put them in is ease of living, connected communities, smart governance, and urban resilience. Essentially, some of the cities across the world call themselves sustainable cities. Some are called future cities. In India, we call them smart cities. Essentially, these are the elements where we are a connected city, we are a livable city, we are an adaptable city, we are resilient, And we have, we have a good governance system. Essentially, these are ingredients of all these definitions across the world. So these are pretty much things which are bucketed within these segments. And while I am talking of them in separate buckets, most of them are interlinked as far as the implementation on ground is concerned. But I'll just show you some glimpses because I'll just maybe have a couple of more minutes with me to end my talk. These are some of the works which are happening. In fact, only a few years, 3 years down the line, I mean, to be able to build a narrative about complete streets which are both accessible to all kinds of population and also accessible to all kinds of vehicles and in fact non-motorized transport, promote walking, promote cycle sharing, and promote cycling. So this is the kind of work which is happening. These are photographs of Pune and Surat. Then when we talk of ease of living, we also talk of recreational space, we talk of open space, we talk of urban spaces which are inviting to people, where people not only walk through those spaces, they actually stay there. They have the staying power, so they create staying power. So these are some of the examples of work which is happening. This is Bhadrakali, which is in Warangal, and the other project is Ajmer. This is the Anna Sakar lakefront, which have been just completed. A lot of work is happening in education, and most of it is happening the smarter way, where technology is not only being used to become the input and the output mediums of education, but it's also being used as a learning management tool and a tool for communities getting engaged with the entire learning process of municipal schools and government schools across the country. Very significant results are coming from various cities. We're also looking at skill development, innovation in small bits in cities. Skill development essentially, yes, in a very different way. For example, the Lighthouses program, which is working in Pune, is a very, very different approach to how skill development should happen in the country. And it's showing very good results where urban youth, especially from the slums, who would end up in utter confusion and utter, there are a lot of emotional stresses that these youth go through, and because of which even if they get employed, they get out of employment very soon. Those are the kinds of problems which are getting tackled here. And the B-Nest, this is the incubation center that Bhopal has put together, is promoting startups into the smart city space, and so are many other cities. Most cities are now starting to understand the basic, basic reason why cities exist. Cities are for people. In fact, we shape our cities, and our cities then start to shape us. And therefore, the more people feel connected to the cities, there is more vibrancy, and there is a lot of buzz in the city, and therefore people want to come to that city. And therefore, even simple projects like these find expression. And there are many cities who are going for public art and heritage development, culture and working on art to make the difference and engage and connect with their citizens. A lot of work is happening on heritage buildings. Forts are being remodeled and redesigned and recreated. A lot of work is happening in conservation, which is also for the connect with the citizens and the city. Then the high-tech part of it, in fact, technology is only a medium. Definitely technology is not the end. These command and control centers were pretty much non-existent in our country 3 years back under the mission. Now, today we have about 11 of them operational. And another 14 would get operational in the next 3 months. And probably in the next 1.5 years, we'll have 50 or more operational. These are cities' nerve centers. In fact, when you have a thunderstorm outside in Delhi, and you have two systems which need to speak to each other. For example, the environmental warning needs to speak to the street light system and say that there is a dark light situation here, there is a situation of problem. The luminosity of the street lights needs to go up. Those are the kinds of activities which are triggered through the command and control center. Crime prevention, management of public transport, monitoring of the environment, and so many other safety of women, the elderly, the children on roads. Why is it that 30% population, the cohort of population of the elderly and children being 30%, we find that only 10% of actual numbers of all pedestrians are constituted by children and elderly. Therefore, there's significant issues of access, significant issues of security, and those are getting tackled because of the technology which is being built behind it. There's a lot of work on IoT happening in cities. And while we have now journeyed about 3 years, we're also getting into standardization and seeing how replicability happens, how peer-to-peer learning happens, so that more cities start to gain out of it, even outside the smart cities mission. These are some examples. Then solar is another area of work. Diu is incidentally one of the first districts now in the country where 100% energy in the daytime is solar. There are some other cities which are working on solar energy. Most cities in the next 5 years are trying to ensure that at least 8 to 10% of the entire energy used by the city is from either solar or wind energy. Water supply, one of the major problems that our cities need to resolve today is of reliable, clean, portable water supply 24 hours to all its citizens. And a lot of work is happening in this sector. A lot of work is also happening on water reuse, recycling of wastewater in most cities. And small and big results are starting to happen in most cities. We would see very good results going ahead because all the cities are concentrated on these basic, for example, education, water. These are basic core of all smart city plans for cities. Then, of course, as I said, another thing which probably was not being talked about in our country about 3 years back, now about 14 cities have actually started on public bike sharing models of various kinds, and more cities are coming on. Of course, the bigger problem to resolve is the problem of complete streets, of security, of access to cyclists. And so most cities are working on that. That's the infrastructure bit, that's the plan bit, that's the policy bit. And on top of it come initiatives like public bicycle sharing, where cities have evolved multiple models to make this happen. So these were some glimpses and some snapshot of the Smart Cities mission. I'll be happy to take questions. Thank you for being patient for my talk. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for giving us a great overview of the Smart Cities project and all that India is doing. Hopefully we'll get to listen from Mr. Jonathan Tor. After you, actually, Professor P.S.N. Rao, who is also the Director of School of Planning and Architecture, has regretted. So we'll move on. In fact, we will, Mr. Jonathan Tor will share the Singapore experience with us.
Yes. So Thank you, Ambassador Amar. Well, this is actually a very interesting topic, and I don't think anyone has really come up with a clear, fixed definition of smart cities, right? So I wonder if we are talking about the same thing. But smart cities is pretty much a buzzword, given how urbanization has become such a major challenge in the developing world. So today I would just like to share a few broad perspectives from the ASEAN and Singapore angle. For myself, I'm no expert on urbanization, but I've been involved pretty much with Singapore-India relations and how we've also worked with India, collaborated on smart cities together over the past several years. So I just hope to share a few, 2 or 3 broad pointers with you today. But to begin, just a very quick overview of what Singapore's chairmanship represents this year, because smart cities is also embedded in one of the key pillars. Essentially, it's defined as resilient and innovative, to have an ASEAN that is resilient and innovative, because we have been facing a lot of complex global challenges, and ASEAN as a body, while diverse, really needs to step up to these challenges such as terrorism, cyber threats, natural disasters, and promoting a rules-based order. So that is on the resilient front. But on the innovative front, we also see a lot of disruptive technologies changing our lives. And we find that it is important for ASEAN to, before look for opportunities to innovate. And part of this innovation includes areas like e-commerce, like smart cities, the digital revolution, things that as an organization we are able to find the synergies to help each other to take on a more innovative approach. So this in a nutshell is the context of how I would like to fit smart cities into this short discussion. Well, the second point is we are quite aware of the urban challenges that lie ahead. I think Ambassador Amar did give some very stark statistics. In the next 20, 30 years, what's it, more than 2/3 of the world will be urbanized. I mean, already half the world is living in cities, which is a huge number. And in ASEAN, we actually have a figure, 90 million more people will be urbanized by 2030 in ASEAN out of a population of 600 million. And when we break down these cities, we consider what we call mid-weight cities, middleweight cities, between 200,000 to 2 million. And we see that these cities are going to drive up to 40% of the region's growth. So smart cities and how it applies to urbanization is something that we need to think about seriously, which is why Singapore, as ASEAN Chair this year, had proposed some suggestions how we could work closer together. But one of the points is that urbanization is not something that happens because the government wants it. But I think from many examples you will see people vote with their feet. They go to the cities because there are better jobs there, more integrated services. In fact, when I was serving in India, I would often get this question when sometimes we talk about smart cities, we talk about Singapore being an urbanized center, and they will say, oh, why does India need to talk about urbanization? You know, Singapore, you're small, you are able to do urbanization in that way. I thought about it and I reflected and said, well, you know, if you are a third-tier city and you didn't pay much attention to the infrastructure, before you know it, it may become a second-tier city because people start coming in for services and start coming in for jobs. And before you know it, your second-tier city may become a first-tier city. So the point I was trying to make is that it's never too early to start thinking about the challenges of urbanization. But within it, how do we address some of these challenges? And for us in Singapore, we look at it from 2 points of view. How can we identify various technological platforms that could help us in the delivery of public services and to improve quality of life? So 2 parts we feel could be useful and instructive. One is interoperability. Can our systems work in a way like a plug and play? Are they able to connect rather than trying to reinvent it or trying to have a monolithic system? For example, ASEAN is a very diverse group. Surely we cannot say, oh, the whole ASEAN must look in one particular way. It cannot be. So, but every unique feature of ASEAN in terms of their cities, if there are certain standards and platforms we can use and interoperate together, we find that that could be one way that the whole ASEAN could network together in terms of smart cities. The other part is on integrated services. I mean, at the end of the day, citizens demand integrated services. That's why you go to a city. I think the urban experts will be able to expound that much better than I, but if you were in a rural area, it would probably be more difficult to access certain services. So I think any smart city that you come up with has to address being integrated. So the last point I would like to make is on some of the steps, practical steps that we can take when we look at smart cities. And for us, we have proposed an ASEAN Smart Cities Network. And that has been one of the key priorities for our chairmanship, to try to drive this regional smart city development. And that's something the ASEAN leaders have adopted a concept note recently. And within that concept note, 26 pilot cities were proposed to see how we could create that interoperability amongst these cities. And from this ASEAN Smart Cities Network, to create a framework that can help establish the key principles of developing smart cities, to establish various core outcomes, and to be able to develop the smart cities. So, if I were just to turn briefly to the experience Singapore has had with India, we've been developing or working together to develop the 29th capital city in India, in Amravati, Andhra Pradesh. And 4 years ago, after a change of government in Andhra Pradesh, the Singapore government collaborated with the Andhra Pradesh government to master plan a new smart city, a greenfield city, and also they are in a process where a consortium is developing the seat area, the key part of the city. It's certainly challenging, but I think when we look at the 100 smart cities in India, it is truly visionary, and it's something that we would like to see how these smart cities can also connect with the various proposed ASEAN smart cities that we have put up as pilots. The other part about Singapore-India cooperation, a couple of years ago, Prime Minister Modi, when he was in Singapore, spoke about how he would like to see Singapore and India enhance collaboration on the smart cities front. We immediately worked on capacity building to share our experiences with 100 Indian urban officials across India to look at how we could gain from some of the experiences and mistakes Singapore had made over the past to share it with our friends in India. And it was a very successful outcome because each of the 100 officials that came away from the program actually took on specific practical projects from their own cities and their own states that they came from. And that really helped both Singapore and India also to understand the challenges of urbanization. And it's also helped Singapore also to understand how India and ASEAN can work closer together in this ASEAN Smart Cities Network. So that's all I have to share. I hope it has given you at least a broad idea from the political point of view from a regional group, ASEAN, of how we are trying to connect and develop our own smart cities. We too have the same challenges that India faces, and there's much that we can do to collaborate with each other. Of course, Singapore being a city, whether it's smart or not, we've not really quite gone to specifically say whether we are a smart city or not, but I think we try to look at the things that may have gone right and the things that may have gone wrong, and try to put it together to see how we can work with our friends, not only in India but ASEAN, to take forward this idea and this vision of an ASEAN Smart Cities Network. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Jonathan. Thank you for giving us an idea of course, the first thing, the sense of confusion, whether Singapore is smart or not. Let me assure you, it is perhaps, you always know when a city is smart when you look at it. You don't have to define it. Singapore is a smart city, not only smart in a sort of impersonal way, but both are extremely livable city. And surely we would like to, in the later part of the session, would like to learn more about what is happening on Amravati and how your experience has been and where we are on that project. Without wasting time, let me now bring in Mr. Sanjeev Sanyal, who of course wear multiple hats. He's the chief principal economic advisor. He's basically an economist, but his first love is history, so he's authored a number of books. But interestingly, I think he's also an urban theorist, which I learned from your CV, that one of his key areas of interest is urbanization and urban spaces. May I request Mr. Sanyal to make his presentation?
Thank you very much. What I'm going to try and do is to give you some flavor of what on earth do we mean by smart cities. And particularly how this particular approach that we are trying to adopt here in India is a break from how we used to think about cities and hopefully, therefore, lead to somewhat different urban outcomes. Now, one of the problems with the term smart cities is obvious. People confuse it with smartphones, and they then tend to take the view that it's something to do with digital technologies, big data, or something like that. And while, of course, the latest technologies must be deployed in thinking about cities, and I'm all in favor of that, one needs to dislink how we think about cities from what happens to be the current technology for a very simple reason. While you can upgrade your smartphone every year or two, obviously, whatever you do with your city, you're stuck with. So you've got to think in decades, if not more. So let me clarify that even if we took all the latest technologies and deployed it to solve various urban issues, the fact is that within a couple of years, that is going to become outdated. And the worst thing to do is to try and integrate all these technologies in such a way that they all flow into each other. In fact, you will end up with a disaster because that integrated system will not be able to organically evolve into the future. If you want to know what I'm talking about, think about Masdar city just built outside Abu Dhabi. It was planned as the cutting edge of technology about a decade or so ago. It is already outdated and it hasn't yet taken off. So the point is, in order to be smart, a city has to be able to do the following things. First of all, it has got to be, ultimately a city is not an agglomeration of buildings or infrastructure. That is why we need to break away from the old civil engineering and master plan view of the world to begin to think of cities as somewhat organically evolving beings, ecosystems that are continuously being buffeted with all kinds of shocks, and can consequently, a smart city is one that can evolve with time. That is very important. Second, a smart city is a place that smart people want to go and live in. Human agglomeration is absolutely key to, so ability to evolve and ability to agglomerate good quality human capital are the true single most important attributes of a smart city. Now, all very good to say this. Now, how does this change the way we think about cities? And I'm going to deliberately use some examples, some of which may come from Singapore, partly because I've lived in Singapore many years and was involved in various ways about Singapore's urban thinking, and of course in honor of Jonathan, who is also from Singapore. Now, I'll just show you the contrast in thinking between an engineering, rigid, siloed, civil engineering worldview and an organic worldview as deployed in Singapore. About a decade or so ago, both Singapore and Delhi decided to opt for hosting the Formula One race every year. Great idea. Delhi and the planners of Delhi saw this as an engineering problem of trying to get cars to move as fast as possible on a track. So they thought about this for a while, and then they acquired land outside the city, and they built this fabulous place called the Budh Racing Circuit. Singapore also looked at the same problem, but they didn't see it as an engineering problem about getting cars to go faster. Who cares about how fast the cars go as long as all the cars have the same track? They saw it as a way of having a good party in the middle of the city. So what did they do? They basically cleaned up and improved the middle of the city, the tracks in the middle of the city. And for 2 days a year, over a weekend, they basically shut down this part of the city and allow these cars to race at night in and around the city. And it has a great party, fantastic publicity for Singapore tourism because the whole world watches it. It happens at night, so it's got very glitzy. There's lots of rock concerts. And essentially, Singapore gets enormous amount of urban buzz in the middle of the city, which is essentially what they were trying to do in the first place. Delhi, meanwhile, built this fabulous racetrack, which is great for moving cars fast outside the city. It ended up becoming such an expensive project that ultimately they had to increase the prices and taxes, and there was a dispute, and in fact we ended up not even using it for Formula One anymore after a couple of years. It's lying there as a completely wasted white elephant outside in a suburb of Delhi. Now just imagine if we had had the Singaporean approach. First of all, we would have run, just imagine Formula One cars racing down Rajpath late at night, fluorescent cars, a big party, racing around the Connaught Place, and one, we would have had an amazingly good time. Two, it would have been radically cheaper, and most importantly, it would have focused on what we were trying to do, is to get people to come in there and create urban buzz. And just imagine the publicity to Indian tourism of fluorescent cars racing down Rajpath and taking sharp turns around India Gate. Now this is why an organic view of a city is a radically different way of thinking about cities than the old master planned civil engineering approach to city building. I'll give you another example, and this we have done systematically since independence. When we build universities, we do the following thing, which is we go outside the city somewhere and take 500 acres of land, and we'll stick all the students and etc. and build a large wall around it. Now, if we want to build a really good institute, instead of 500, we'll take 1,000 acres. Now, that surely will solve our education problem. But in fact, from an urban perspective, this is crazy. Because if cities are about agglomerating smart people, then it should be about trying to create interaction between the new human capital you're bringing into the city and the city itself. Unfortunately, because we take this via the siloed approach again, there is no benefit to Kanpur of hosting IIT Kanpur. There's no benefit to Kharagpur of hosting IIT Kharagpur. Sadly, we used to, before independence, build universities, etc., inside the city. I mean, some of our best academic institutions are still within the city, whether it's in Xavier's Kolkata, or Sydenham in Mumbai, or many of the College of Delhi University. But since independence, because we took this siloed, inorganic approach to university building, we actually do not benefit at all from the human capital agglomeration that should happen through these institutions. Now, I'll contrast this again with Singapore. Singapore, about 15 years ago, decided to build a brand new university called Singapore Management University. Now, where did it decide to do this? Now, even in a city like Singapore, there's actually enough real estate to build a nice large campus somewhere at the periphery. Instead, Singapore built Singapore Management University bang in the middle of its financial district on what is the most expensive real estate in this part of the world. Why did it do it? Because it understood that it is the interaction between these students, bringing young people in the middle of the city, allowing these young people to interact with their market, which is, of course, the financial district, which is right next door. It allows the people working in financial markets to come and teach, to hold seminars and participate, and therefore creating an ecosystem of intellectual activity. And this is not even unique. I mean, look around the world. All great cities around the world have great universities. London has LSE, it has LBS, many others. There are Oxford and Cambridge, which are, of course, started out as universities, but now are towns. Oxford was always a town, but Cambridge has now become more of a town. And of course, there's Boston, which is home to a large number of academic institutions which drive those cities. And yet, we repeatedly make this mistake of creating siloed, walled-off academic institutions out there in the boondocks. I mean, who are not thought that it was a great idea to take several thousand acres of desert land outside Jaipur and build a new IIT there? What's the purpose of? I mean, you have more acres of land than students. With that, let me stop and hand it back to Amar.
Thank you very much for these very, of course, like a good writer and historian, you're also a very good storyteller. Thank you for these very stark comparisons. Of course, we are, as I said, that Singapore has a different set of problems when it tries to evolve into a smart city. We are looking at multiple layers of complexities, And in fact, many of our smart cities projects are really, frankly, trying to supplement or do what municipal bodies should have done long ago, they didn't do. So a lot of resources are going there. We are looking at resettlement of slums, we are looking at poverty elimination, we are trying to create jobs while we create smart cities. So the issues are different, but your point is well taken that we have to think of cities as something organic, where citizen is at the center, rather than just looking at good infrastructure. We have 20 minutes, I think. At 5 we have to close. We have 25 minutes. So we will be happy to take questions from the floor. All the 3 experts would be happy to answer your questions. Just keep it as a question rather than a statement. Thank you. Just identify yourself and tell me who do you want to take your question. Thanks.
Hi, I'm Arjun. I'm a student at Georgetown University. And my question is actually about, again, smart cities, obviously. But given the HDB projects in Singapore and given changing notions of ownership versus asset use due to the sharing economy, talk about Uber, Airbnb, what are some changes in land ownership patterns or real estate use that we can anticipate in the years going forward? And whichever panelist wishes to answer.
Kunal should. In fact, I could add another question to you, that what are we doing to make sure that what has happened to our cities in the past doesn't happen again, and the simple thing of respect of property rights, whether these properties belong to the government or to individuals, because that is where I think the problem starts. Sir, is it a related question, Gautam?
Not really. Yeah, but it's also to Kunal.
If it's not related, let him answer this question.
Well, real estate, I think as far as smart cities thinking goes and the way we are thinking about it, it's mostly about how do we look at our planning the way it has been in the past, and how do we make a break from the mistakes which we have done in the past to let our cities become unaffordable for a lot many people. So there are obviously answers which lie in the urban planning processes that we have followed so far. So one area of work is urban planning, and how do we really, through our planning processes, the way we treat our cities as an organic entity, how do we look at creating more affordable cities, and that's possible. The second, of course, is how do we look at cities we all say that our cities produce the maximum GDP. I mean, 80% of our GDP going forward today, 61% comes from India's cities. How do we make cities develop as engines of growth, and how does that speed up in the future? And what is the kind of real estate? What is the kind of diversity in real estate? What is the kind of real estate which looks at getting smarter people into cities, getting the connections that they need to be intertwined with to be able to create the kind of economy that we all aspire for will happen. Then I think we have to look at even the design elements in our cities as far as real estate goes, because some design elements in the way we design our urban spaces, in the way we design our buildings, and the way we design our real estate are inviting in nature, and some are which completely put you off, or maybe are not inviting in nature in a way where people would really love to engage with that kind of infrastructure. So I think these are the solutions, these are the thoughts that come to my mind. I don't know if I've answered your question, but it's more on how we make people engage with the built and non-built infrastructure in the city. That's going to matter going forward.
Sorry.
I'd like to answer that question as well. It's actually a very important question. And by the way, when the Smart City mission was being put together, I was not in government, but I was invited to come and give various ideas. So the way it ended up has something to do with many of these ideas about organic cities that I just mentioned. This is why the Smart City mission, for example, has lots of things like heritage precincts and parks, etc., embedded in it, which would not have been if we had taken the other smart city interpretation. So anyway, but specifically about your thing about real estate. Now, the key thing to understand about real estate and housing is that housing is not about simply providing shelter in a static sense of the word. Ultimately, housing is a very important way of allowing socio-economic mobility. Therefore, and particularly the HDB example, you have to think about housing as a ladder. And now, why is this important? And I'll give you one example. It's a long debate, but I'll give you just one example. The importance of rentals in India. For a long, long time, rentals was thought of being something bad because it required landlords rent seeking from poor tenants, and therefore we had this entire worldview derived about rent control and all kinds of problems with property rights, and most of those rights being about tenancy rights. But in fact, as a result of which, over the last half a century, the rental market in India has become very, very inefficient, and many of our cities, and I have a whole section in the last economic survey that we published on the fact that large chunks of real estate in Indian cities is actually simply locked up and not in a part of the system because nobody wants to rent them out. Landlords would just rather keep them locked and stashed away. Whereas rental is in fact key in a society that is mobile. You're talking about, after all, what is the first place that a migrant moves to? He needs a place to stay. He needs to rent it. So providing him cheap housing to buy is irrelevant. He needs a cheap place to rent. He needs then, having gotten into the city, he wants to climb that ladder. What he doesn't want is, again, this idea that we have, oh, we must provide cheap subsidized housing to buy. No. Why do you want to lock this person into a certain step? The whole purpose of moving into the city or to another city or within a city is to continuously climb the socio-economic ladder. Consequently, two things are important. One, rental, and secondly, good secondary markets. That's why transaction costs have to be kept as low as possible in order to allow socio-economic mobility, of which housing obviously is an important part. So this misdirected idea of keeping stamp duties and other things very high or discouraging rental actually goes against this worldview of urbanism.
Thank you.
May I add to that, since it's about HDB? I think, Sanjeev, you made a very good point about HDB and the social economic aspects of it. But I think one of the key areas of success of the housing estate in Singapore is that we do not discriminate between the so-called lower strata of society. That means within a housing estate, you would have embedded the lower income, the middle income, and the rich people, and all have equal access to services in that area. What that does is, in, I guess, an urban planning context, it doesn't allow a slum to develop. It doesn't allow property prices to drop just because nobody wants to live there. So in any housing estate, you would be assured of a set of public services that are integrated and that you're able to access, even if you're not well off. So I think this is something worth thinking about. Of course, there are other draconian things Singapore can do, like land acquisition, which India would have a great challenge. I mean, as you rejuvenate cities, you have leasehold, you have a master plan where you're able to change certain users to help restructure the city for use, such that it evolves, as what Sanjeev had talked about, where you can bring in smart people and create an urban buzz. Thanks.
Excuse me.
Yes, Ambassador there.
Yeah, I'd like to compliment for this presentation. I have
So he was waiting before, sir.
Let him speak because he's waiting.
You can have the next one.
Well, to a certain extent, part of the question was answered by Kunal in response to his question. Of late, I've been huge. I grew up in Patna, studied in Dehradun, lived in Delhi, not exactly the most beautiful cities in the world. And of late, I've been rather engaged in the Northeast. Now, one of the things that sincerely troubles me is that, Northeast is seen as a kind of tourism hotspot. But anywhere in India you go, the views, the landscapes are very seriously marred by poor construction, sorry building codes, actually just ugly construction. Ugly construction and construction waste, starting from the roads to the railways and eventually to the cities. Now, I know you had a slide showing the murals somewhere and you did talk about urban design, but in what time frame do you think we can make our cities a little more aesthetic and beautiful? And particularly where we want to promote tourism.
Oh, thank you for that question. In fact, a time frame, a guess on a time frame could be, your guess could be as good as mine, but instead of putting numbers to the time frame, we should be talking about the processes that we need to take care of to be able to achieve the kind of excellence that you're talking about. It's also about how we create standards for the work that we do in cities. Most of the works that we do, even the biggest of technological things that we do or the simplest things we do, have to have a certain standards, guidelines, principles for them to happen. So a large part of the work that is happening within the Smart Cities mission is about this. This is about the foundational work which needs to happen before we start doing things. So when I was talking of the public bicycle sharing and this public cycling, the culture of cycling to come into cities, I was talking about how do we make our streets, the design of streets so that they become equitable not only to each class of people, whether it is able, disabled, whether it's elderly, the children, women, men, all kinds, or to all kinds of vehicles, whether it's cycle, whether it is pedestrians, whether it is buses, all kinds. This is something which is work in progress in many cities, and you can see some of the streets getting redesigned to be able to become equitable to all modes of transport and all kinds of people. Similar approaches need to be, whether we design public buildings, whether we design public parks. So a lot of work which we are doing under the mission is to create frameworks, create those high-level thought strategy documents, and capacity build the cities to understand. Even doing a park, let's say 5 kilometers away from the city, is not going to serve the purpose. As Sanjeev ji was talking about, how the infrastructure built within the city engages the citizens, and that's what we're trying to tell them. How do we build parks? How do we build these spaces around communities? How do we understand? How do we even study public life? How do we even see how people interact with our cities and design our cities accordingly? These are processes which are being initiated. All our cities are at a very different level. If you see the kind of human resources you have in cities which haven't had the municipal culture so far, never had good officers posted there. They've always been only doing housekeeping for the state governments and never have really thought about creating infrastructure in the cities. They're at a different level of capacity and some others are at a different level of capacities. But what we understand now, the processes through which all these cities need to be taken through have to be similar. We cannot have a grade B process or a grade C process for a city which is a laggard. Then we continuously give them perverse incentives to be laggards because they get some favorite kind of treatment when they are laggards. So we're getting them through the same processes. We're getting them all onto a same set of guidelines. Of course, the process of creating the guidelines will be pretty much bottom up, but the framework would be developed by all the cities and by the mission together so that everyone gets together to come to that level. That is the thought that is being built within the mission.
Thank you. We have just time for one last question we can take.
Yeah, thank you. I have two very short connected questions. Now, we are talking these smart cities here in the context of ASEAN. My first observation is that apart from the infrastructure and the finances that have been provided for that, what about the capacity building with regard to good governance and smart governance across ASEAN? Because this is not limited to India alone. That's one thing, so that it can be sustained. And the other question is, in context of India, we have seen the National Green Tribunal the environmental jurisprudence, which is very active, whether it was the matter relating to Yamuna bed, or it is the waste management, or recently the rainwater, etc. Now, how are we going to take care that we do not cross the environmental jurisprudence expectations? Thank you.
Okay, and there are two things. I'll respond to the earlier question as well, which I think is a very critical question, because I too object to PWD architecture ugliness, which you'll be amazed to know is actually embedded in our building codes. The reason we build ugly buildings across the country today, and weren't doing so before, say, the 1950s, is because today that ugliness is actually there in our codes. Why is it there in our codes? Because, unfortunately, at a very unfortunate moment in our history, we created text-based codes. And so we, for all time to come, have embedded Le Corbusier's brutalist worldview into our architecture. Now, this has to be unwound, and you will be pleased to know that there will be shortly some sort of a discussion document on the new urban policy. But one of the issues that we bring is to firstly unwind this, allow for greater diversity of codes across the country, and more importantly, to move to much more form-based codes as opposed to these text-based codes. So this is sadly something we impose on ourselves. It's no architect can build a beautiful building today. I mean, today, if you had to apply it, the Taj Mahal could not have been built because our architectural rules would not have allowed it. Now, as far as environmental jurisprudence is concerned, that is obviously for the, not a matter of here, but yes, one of the key things about urban design has got to be its environmental sustainability. And in this context, we have got to begin to think much more seriously about the business of density. It is now well established that denser cities are less environmentally disruptive. The question is, how do you create denser cities that are also simultaneously livable? Because we cannot ever go back and build something like Chandigarh again. Awful. It's a subsidy scheme for civil servants, but environmentally a disaster. So we have to think about density seriously, and consequently about public transport and other things that make dense cities livable.
On the environmental thing, I'll just end with a short comment. In fact, there's a lot of ambiguity in even the debate that happens around environmental things, and we have to be very cautious when we take sides on environment. I'll just give you a very hilarious example. I mean, if you just see a paintbrush which has a plastic handle, some people will say that is more sustainable because it is not a wooden handle and therefore you not cut trees to make it. And somebody comes with a paintbrush which has a wooden handle, he'll say this is more environmentally sustainable, it doesn't use plastic. So, I mean, the two sides of saying the same thing. So it is a very difficult call to take. We all understand that, these are very superficial things in which we get lost when we get into the environmental debate. It's a much more serious debate than this, and therefore that complexity needs to be a part of the debate when we talk about environment.
On urban governance, I think that's a very important topic and something that all countries need to look at very closely. On Singapore's part, we take that very seriously and have been organizing something called the World Cities Summit once every 2 years. In fact, it just ended the week before, where we bring together government officials and practitioners to look at how we could improve and enhance urban governance, not just for our country, our cities, but our region. That's something we have worked with closely with many of our partners, for example, India, also within ASEAN. I think there's certainly a lot more that can be done. But the key is, how can we share with each other the mistakes that we've made so that we do not make the same mistake again? Governance is not just about getting the things right, but not getting those wrong things done again. So I think that's something that ASEAN, amongst our partners, given the ASEAN Smart Cities Network, this will be one of the areas that we'll be looking at, and also bilaterally between Singapore and India. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I don't know whether all the questions have been answered, but unfortunately we have run out of time. But of course, the expositions have laid out the complexity and the number of problems that if you to tackle, if you really want to have smart cities needs smart buildings, smart contractors, most importantly, smart governance. And what I always feel that smart cities will only be smart if they are smart citizens, and that we need to focus on that as well. Well, thank you very much. We I think, ending on time, because we have to prepare the stage and room for the next session. Thank you.
Thank you. We come